perhaps we, with that, have reached a point where we can enter the debate. And I assume you may also want to react to what other panelists said, but we'll hopefully be able to integrate that into the debate, right? So please, any questions? I have lots of questions, but I will hold back. Harry.
Yes, thanks very much. Very exciting for Finn to listen. I'm working as a professor here at the IES, not at all working with the Arctic region as such, but I guess some background knowledge simply from a national perspective. Now, what I would be interested to hear, because you raised a lot of, or a couple of areas where there are kind of conflicts, or that it's a nuanced picture geographically or so forth. But one of the things which to me seems also nuanced or complicated is that the issues themselves are actually not in an obvious synchrony with one another, because when you want to integrate into the policy something which is on the one hand gas and climate, in some circles at least these are very opposing kind of ideas. Gas is not often seen as necessarily promoting the climate, it can be the reverse, or the environment and transport. It can also be seen, it could be argued, I guess, that okay, you need to do it particularly sustainably then to develop it, but one could also argue that the more shipping you have, the worse it is, no matter how you do it, right? Any consumption is bad. So I was just interested in how do these kind of substantive intricacies play into the regional complexity that is there. I guess it doesn't help things.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else or related to that, or no? Then perhaps we'll return to the panel. I was actually also struck by climate change and sustainable development as two areas. When I teach my international law class, it's usually on sustainable development, and climate change is one subject under it, right? But I understood sustainable development in that context is a shortcut for economic development that is sustainable. But there are different understandings in the world about the term. Perhaps we just, with that general question, perhaps go back, and you have also the chance then to react to what the other speakers on the panel said. Marianne, perhaps? Yeah, indeed.
If you still want. I thank you very much for that comment. I think there are two aspects of your comment, your question. The first one is integrating policies. I think that the last Arctic policy was an integrated Arctic policy, and where actually it was not really integrating policies, and therefore the new Arctic policy will have to make more mainstream all the Arctic in all these policies, energy, transport. For example, the European Union has an energy policy, which is clear, has all strategy on LNG and everything. But for the moment, in all these policies, it was no special place where developments in energy, for example, in the Arctic is taken into account. One example. Secondly, connectivity. The European Union issued a couple of months ago a strategy on connecting Europe with Asia, where I think the people who wrote, I mean, we had consultations on it, but they did not have a map in front of them. But if you want to connect Asia with Europe, one of the obvious lane is the northern one, but it was obviously that they wanted to avoid that. Transport, the trans-European networks, for example. If you look there on a map of the trans-European, it stops in northern Europe. It doesn't go until the Arctic, and therefore I think all these things the Arctic has to be streamlined. When we're speaking about all these policies, there has to be it has to be the mainstream and taking into account. We obviously take into account the north and the east and the west and the south, but not the north in these internal EU policies. That's one thing. The question you mentioned on how do you combine actually transport, more shipping, more industrial development, and then the main concern of climate change. I would say this is the question. This is the most difficult issues. And I spoke last year. I was invited to be the annual guest speaker at the College of Europe. These are not students of Greenpeace, activists. These were of the international section of the College of Europe. And nearly all the questions of the students were related to climate change. And the question I had, can't the European Union not stop that there is oil extraction in the Arctic? I said, we cannot, but we do not have that competence to do it. But I mean, this is a key issue. And you see now with the shipping, you have several companies, European companies, who said, we will not use the Northern Sea Road. I spoke with a Finnish diplomat, and he said, but those companies who are saying this, they will not use the Northern Sea Route in any case. But the issue of using heavy oil in Arctic waters is terrible, and the European Union is, within the framework of the International Maritime Organization, will be supporting a moratorium of using heavy oil in the Arctic. But therefore, I think that we have to be consistent in all our transport policy also. But the question of the minerals, if, for example, we had, and she was at the Arctic conference yesterday as well, a representative of an industrial park in Norway, a brilliant young lady, and she was explaining that we need these essential minerals. It has been said here before, we need them. We have in any case to use them, extract them. Is it not in our interest to extract them in a sustainable way from the European Arctic, then from places in Asia where maybe it's not done in a sustainable way? So if you in any case need these, I don't want to open the discussion on oil. I think that will be in conflict with Andreas, but and here it's maybe there are quite a lot of concern about further oil. Gas, I'm less. Gas is less pollutant than I would say than the oil, but it's a key question to combine it. And just comments on some of what I said I have been having quite a lot of panels with Andreas, and it's always a big pleasure to have it. And I think we agree on many things, but I do not see Europe as a soft power. In any case, politically, we are an economic power without any doubts, and the European economy is the economy of all the member states, and we have policies for having an economic policy for the European Union, which is our strength. But also politically, we have a defense and security policy. We don't have a military as such, but we have, for example, we have a military staff within the EIS. I discovered it when I was a EU ambassador to Canada. We had a visit of the military staff, and I thought first, they are not with the European External Action Service. But then, no, we have it. And I met, there will be a new head of the of the military staff of the External Service, which I met a couple of weeks ago in Berlin. And he comes from the maritime. And also, they will be more and more be interested in the Arctic. We have a European Defence Agency. The European Defence Agency has been doing a study on to check the maritime capabilities of EU member states in the Arctic. Not limited to military, but we cannot say that we only a soft power and that we have a military and security policy. We consider ourselves as being one of the biggest main securities providers in the world. Of course, it's more focused then on piracy and other hotspots and not on the Arctic. But I don't agree that we say, we're only a soft power.
Yeah. Just to follow up, I think it was actually Mikael Jansson who used the word soft power, but I agree with you to an extent. I think as a scholar who looks at security policy, I am eager to see more EU engagement on the security, on the geopolitical aspects of the Arctic as well, recognizing the EU and the Arctic as an arena where this is important, but also an arena where you need to grapple with Russia. And that's one big aspect of the EU's Arctic engagement that I would like to see more of, is more of the how do we engage with a dialogue with Russia. Now, 5 years after Crimea, almost 6. Yes, the Northern Dimension exists, but it has not maybe progressed as much as some had hoped. I was at the Northern Dimension conference last week in Bodø with parliamentarians from Brussels and the various Arctic countries, also EU members. And there was a realization that cooperation with Russia has, yes, it continues on certain low levels, but it has stalled more generally. And we all know why. But how do we reboot it? So I'm very interested in seeing what an EU focus on security aspects in the Arctic might lead to. So in that sense, don't get me wrong. And going to your question, or the question we had in the back as well, you're hitting at the core, right? But the core of this balancing act between development and climate change, or we can talk about Russia as well, right? We need cooperation with Russia because they're a neighbor state. I mean, we have a border. We need to cooperate on search and rescue fisheries, also on security issues. The Norwegian armed forces talks to the Russian armed forces on a weekly basis. So this happens. At the same time, we sanction them, and we need to punish for Ukraine and Crimea. So you see that those balancing acts occurring across the board. I think the problem, that at least from a Norwegian perspective or a Canadian perspective that I know as well, has been the perception of the EU meddling in these questions that are national questions. And we can argue whether they are national questions or whether the EU should meddle or not, or you can use a different word than meddle even. And I'm not saying the EU has done anything wrong in it, but I think from national politicians in Oslo or in Ottawa, this notion that suddenly someone in Brussels is hinting normatively at what you should do. No, you should not develop those resources in the Arctic because that's not good for climate change. Or no, you should not do X and Y to your seals or to cooperation with Russia, etc., etc. That causes this gut reaction that I think has caused more trouble for the EU than anything else. And in many ways, it's been exaggerated. It's been too much. But I think, and that's another debate, I mean, you as an Institute for European Studies, we could debate about the EU's approach more generally to the world. I mean, some have described it as if not arrogant, then at least it sometimes has this top-down approach, that the EU knows best. And that has, I think, and not anymore, but I think in the early days of its Arctic engagement, as Mikael also said, it caused a bit of problems because Norwegians think that we are the best. And we rejected the EU twice. We don't need the EU. We're better than the EU. So here the EU comes and tells us that we should not develop our oil and gas or develop our mineral resources in the Arctic, but pollution that is leading to the melt of the Arctic is not from the Arctic, right? It's from people driving cars in Brussels. So get your own house in order before you come and tell us what to do. I mean, I'm not saying this is how I feel about it, but I think that's been a lot of the narrative or the discourse in the early days about the Arctic, unfortunately. And I think that led into exactly what you're highlighting, right? This more conflict-driven discussions. But I think a lot of that has gone away, and I think the Arctic community of Arctic ambassadors has really dispelled some of that initial tension.
I need to clarify one
but
point.
perhaps you have to even clarify more after Mikael is. So collect your clarifications.
Okay. No. I mean, to start with that discussion. I think sustainable development. What is that? That is everything, depending on where you self-stand, and you can use it for everything. I mean, sustainable development, is it just economics, but you use in a sustainable way, or is it that you have to have sustainability, which means that you cannot do some things because otherwise it's not sustainable. So I mean, you can have our views, but I think in the Arctic discussion, and what we also found when we started to from the regional level or engage us more into this issue was that, I mean, you have this from within and from without perspectives, and if you look from the outside perspective, you had the debate in the parliament that were stop everything in the Arctic. Arctic is melting. We have to stop everything. As the cause, as exactly as you said, as if the cause for what happens in the Arctic was due to those people, 4 million people in the Arctic. And at the same time you had, so that was more stop it all. And then on the other side you have this get hold of it all. They were not in the parliament or so obviously visible, but they were there. Let us just get all the raw materials we can and skip all the other discussions, whatever raw materials we wanted. So from the outside you had those two sort of very diverse perspectives. From us, from within, we saw what we want is sustainable development. We need economical possibilities to growth, and we do have a lot of solutions, and we are quite good at some things. And at the same time, of course, it has to be done in a sustainable way. And it can be done in a sustainable way if you just look into in fact, the northern part of Sweden and I guess Finland also especially is CO2 neutral because of the forest industry. So even though you are having emissions from the process industry, if you just look at that part, it's more or less CO2 neutral due to the forest industry in combination with the large process industry, which is one of the cleanest in the world still, the process industry, the steel industry. We are getting to a point where we can make steel without coal, being CO2 neutral steel production, which is not happening in other parts of the world where the coal is growing, the use of coal in all aspects. And then you can ask, is it better that we have the possibilities to even more develop this and export it rather than it happens somewhere else? And this you can have all the debate you can have around this, what is the best. But the thing is that for us, of course, we are, as all parts of the world, regions that wants to have development and continue development, and it should of course be a sustainable way, and in that sense we are still quite good. When it comes to, yes, I use the word soft power because, yes, of course, EU do have some military. Of course, EU do have an economy, not so much an own economy. I mean, the budget, the EU budget is 1% of the EU countries' BNI. But of course, as a global actor, when it comes to trade, when it comes to being the internal market, of course, it's a big economy. But it's not run by a president that can tell, now we're doing this, now we're doing that. Either it is China or the US. Easier in China than in the US. Easier in Russia than maybe in the US. But still, we don't have a system where and I don't think Europe and the EU wants to use the military power in real life. We can have it as doing good things to help where you do have crisis and to act. We do have some budgetary measures to do things, but I think what is in the European context the real thing here when it comes to what can EU deliver into this debate beside those large national interests is this soft power, using the people living there, using the money for research in a smart way, using all those parts. And if doing so, the actors and the stakeholders are an important part to build that. So that is my main point with that, not saying that the EU do not have any muscle at all. Of course the EU do have.
So now,
just a clarification on when speaking about EU, a lot of critics which has been formulated here and which I fully understand has been attributed to the EU, but a lot of these critics came from the positions of the European Parliament.
Yeah.
And this is something I have been a kind of European diplomat working in EU delegation for 16 years, so quite a big part of my career. And I often felt that when sometimes the European Parliament was passing a resolution and it caused outbursts in the countries where I was a diplomat, it was attributed to the European Union. Just give one example. When I was EU ambassador to Mexico, the European Parliament passed a resolution that there should be an inquiry of human rights in Mexico. I was summoned immediately at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, saying that, we should tell the European Parliament that it's not possible. I said, that's not how our democratic system works. The same thing with the parliament, for example, in the past saying no more oil exploitations in the Arctic, or I don't know, or other things that they proposed. And also the seal ban originated. I mean, I think that the European we were forced to have this seal ban, but it started all in the European Parliament. So you cannot say, you know, that Europe knows best, and things which the Parliament, which I distance myself. My personal opinion is also that the seals ban was a mistake, because the seals trade would die in itself in any case. But you cannot attribute things which happened, which are for an EU of a parliament, and saying the EU has been saying this or doing that. That's, I think, it's a fundamental difference. But in the public opinion, it's very difficult to make the difference. But we cannot be kept responsible for some positions which are sometimes like unguided missiles. No?
Mm-hmm. And I very much agree. And some of the writings that I've done on EU Arctic policy to international audience or Norwegian audience has been exactly that, to criticize the use of the EU. But in trying to understand why, not so much anymore, because I think now actually there's a better awareness amongst Norwegian decision makers and politicians and media as such about the EU. But back in 2010, 2011, I worked at the Norway office. We got phone calls from the Norwegian media asking us, why does the EU want to ban oil and gas? Why does the EU want to create a new treaty for the Arctic, like the Antarctic? Mm-hmm. And we had to explain, no, it's the European Parliament, it's the European Parliament. But I think it helps explain that initial negative reaction that came from the Arctic states. But I think the lack of EU knowledge in some of those countries that are not part of the EU complicates matters.
Even within the EU.
Yes.
There's been a lot of talk about the European Parliament.
Can you identify yourself?
Yes, exactly. And I sort of feel that this is my role to step in at the moment. I'm an assistant in the European Parliament for an Estonian MEP who was the co-rapporteur for the EU Arctic policy in 2016. Yes, indeed. And then listening to this discussion, and I feel myself a bit divided as well when we think about the actors and the stance that different actors need to make, and even within the EU, when we talk about the EAS, when we talk about DG Mare, when we talk about the European Parliament, or the presidency, whoever is in the lead at the moment, I sort of feel that I want to contribute that within the European Parliament there are very many dividing opinions as well. So, for instance, I can bring you an example when it comes down to report 2016. It was an AFET-ENVI report, meaning it was a joint report from the Committee of Environment and Foreign Affairs. So therefore, we sort of represent the part from the Foreign Affairs, and then you sort of find yourself in the conflict of, not the conflict, but as we said, the sort of like the balancing act that sustainability and let's say oil and gas shares at the same time. So there was a lot of discussions back and forth and a lot of problems of finding the compromise. One thing that I sort of want to point out is that using the word perhaps normative EU stance, I wouldn't say it's quite correct when we talk about non-legislative reports. That's one thing, and another thing, I think, coming from Estonia, so we are bordering Russia as well. So the security issues for us are on the table 24/7. Our point of view, for instance, is that we better have the Norwegian gas than the Russian gas in order to be not accountable for our eastern neighbors, than be accountable for our northern neighbors who we get along very, very well. So I think a lot of these sort of back and forth debates, also with regards to the seal ban, which we were also against. So a lot of these back and forth debates happen in the European Parliament, and it's quite funny to see I think that I can be quite harsh here, is that some people have the expertise in the Parliament, some do not. These are politicians which every country has. So therefore it's quite a tough of a battle inside the institution itself to find some sort of balancing act when it comes to very many national sensitive issues.
May I?
Yeah, and yeah.
Everybody wants to act. I first checked what else is out there, perhaps, to be asked. At the same time, nothing. Then I have to do it.
No, I thank this young lady very much. I started my career, I won't say how many years ago, as a parliamentary assistant of a member of the European Parliament, many, many years ago. And when I joined the European Commission, I started the legal service, and then I worked 12 years in cabinets of the European Commission, commissioners for external relations, for internal market, and for development policy. But all these 12 years, I was within the cabinet responsible for relations with the European Parliament. I have been 15 years every month, with the exception of August, to Strasbourg. So I am a big, and my husband knows this, I'm a big fan of the European Parliament. And I always love to go to the Parliament, and when we had parliamentary delegations coming to the countries where I was serving, for me it was really very important to have them. So the European Parliament plays an important role, and I'm extremely glad that Mr. Payet has taken the initiative to have a group of friends of the Arctic. Something I have been pleading the last 2 years to have it. I don't think it's thanks to me that it was created, but I felt that in any case the last Parliament, that there were maybe different individual members of Parliament who had an interest for the Arctic, but there was not really a kind of group of parliamentarians. So I'm extremely pleased that he is doing that. Also, when we had our EU Ambassadors Conference in September, our annual ones, we had a meeting with the European Parliament, and we had the possibility to have a discussion with the presidents of the parliamentary committees. And I asked the question to Mr. McAllister, who is the president of the External Affairs Committee, what about the Arctic? And he said this is one of the new priorities of his committee, together with Africa, of course. I mean, I have many, but it's so I'm glad that there is. But I fully agree with you that you have different positions, and it's not easy. Even I can understand to have a resolution when we have a new policy on the Arctic. Parliament also will have to make it. It will not be easy because you will have all these extremes, and you have to bring them under one head. But don't misunderstand me. I think it's important that you have to have the Parliament. It's important that you have all these different voices, and it won't be easy to get one position, I think, of the Parliament. But my main point was, you have to understand from the outside world, they don't make a difference. Parliament, Commission, it's all EU. And mainly when the things are bad, it's EU. When the things are positive.
I very much agree. I mean, I sound like the very anti-EU Norwegian here, but back in Norway, I'm too pro-EU, I think. But I very much agree. I think the European Parliament has been, some people in the Parliament also before your MEP's time were the ones who kept talking about the Arctic when no one else did. So I think the Parliament does a crucial job. And I think the fact that the EU is this complex animal is why Aslak is writing his PhD about the EU and the Arctic, right? Because it's an interesting actor. Norway right now is developing a new Arctic policy, the first one in 7 years. And that happens behind closed doors. It's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs talking to the Ministry of Local Development, and no one really knows. And then suddenly they hand out the paper, and they have 2 consultation meetings. That's not a good process. That's not how you create legitimacy. And the EU has a much more open process, which I applaud. But it causes, yes, some problems. Also talking about gas from Norway, we have an election coming up in a year and a half. The Green Party is suddenly 10-15%. One of their mantras is shutting down the gas industry in the Barents Sea. So maybe the European Parliament will get its wish. Will do no Arctic oil and gas development. Or maybe that won't be your wish in 2 years from now. But it's an interesting development in Norway too, right? It's not like we're just drill, baby, drill in Norway. There's actually quite a big resistance against oil and gas in Norway taking place. But just finally also a comment, because Mikael said something very good, and it's when we talk about the EU's Arctic policy and the soft power debate, and it really depends on the area and what mechanisms the EU actually has. And I think in some ways we're debating two different things here. We're debating the symbolic aspects of the EU's Arctic approach, what it says, and the symbolism of that, and also how that's perceived. And that's something different than the actual policies, the actual Arctic dimensions of Horizon 2020 or the Cohesion Fund or the NSPA, what the NSPA network actually deals with on an everyday basis. And I think it's important also to recognize that these are kind of slightly different debates. We could have a debate about what's the best EU mechanisms for ensuring sustainable projects in the Arctic, or connectivity, investing in the 10T network, etc. But that's a bit different again. So.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, I think the thing with the Parliament is that it delivers a platform for a political debate that otherwise would not have been on the European arena. But of course, I mean, the difficult part for the world around is to realize the difference between an own initiative report and a legislative report or a work, because that an own initiative can be whatever, but often it's considered as, wow, look at what the Parliament has voted. Sometimes I wonder, why need the Parliament to really vote about own initiative reports if it does not really have an impact or meaning or something like that? But that's another discussion, because the more legislative power and the more legislative work on what the Parliament really do have a say in does also need to be, the Parliament then also need to take responsibility, and I think the Parliament is doing so in most of the time. So then, of course, we do have different views politically on what is good and bad, but that is another discussion. And I also very happy that this intergroup this friendship group is created, because I think, I mean, and that's also part of the European democracy. You need the Parliament, you need the Commission and the External Action Service, especially in this case, but also the Ministerial Council, to discuss policy development, because then something interesting is happening here, and you also get all views and perspectives into the debate. And that is a learning process also for those parliamentarians that maybe do not, or the ones in the council that are not having an Arctic knowledge, or also other parts of the Commission, to be engaged in a common discussion, and then you learn something. And if you do that together with stakeholders, us on the regional level, everyone is learning to understand each other, but most of all, you get a legislation and a policy work that is really sound and good, and also makes a difference when it's to be done in the real life. And the thing is, for now, my fear is that for now, geopolitics is sexy. Regional development and day-to-day basis exchange over borders is not that sexy. And I think don't run off in this geopolitical race that I feel now is up and running. Of course, we have to be aware of Russia. Of course, we have to be aware of China, not least. And unfortunately, of course, we have to be aware of the US in those days. And we have to find our way in this new landscape, but in a sound and vivid and sustainable way in the long run, and that we only can do together. So that is my wish for the future, and that we also from the regional level can be a part of this debate. And I just what was said last, that I mean, just this morning we sat with Björn Lyrvall and that is our Arctic ambassador, discussing the new Swedish Arctic policy. And I think that would never ever have happened if we had been a part of the EU and this debate and discussion that we have, that makes also national level to realize when they are developing their new Arctic policy, they must engage much more also in the local perspective, because that didn't happen in the last one. So I think something interesting that we are also quite happy of is happening here, even though we are a bit afraid that we lose sight of the real actions for this discussion on geopolitics, even though we have to have that discussion. And for us, I mean, of course, it's an interest for us, just like so, that one of the reasons why the EU, when it comes to connectivity, has really pressured also the national level that the TNT network are to be connected all the way up to Arctic is the Arctic discussion. Because in those sense, the EU is our friend, because I think the EU sometimes more than especially the Swedish capital are now having this Swedish internal discussion, but do have those global perspectives that the national capitals not always have, because they are so into this is how it looks in our country, rather to see what context we are in. And we start to learn to see that we are in this new, exciting, potentially very vivid and fruitful cooperation and an area of growth with new potentials for new solutions of things and using the cool climate and so forth. But of course, the tensions are there, and we are a part of the solution, I believe.
Absolutely. Can I just
Yes.
I really want to say how much I agree with Mika, what he's saying here about the key role of the global, or the local and the regional level, and the inter-regional cooperation, which when I said what needs to be new, I also said what has to be kept, and I think this is something which will be kept, because there we are strong. And when I was in Umeå in the beginning of October at the occasion of this Arctic Forum, Mikael had invited me, had a dinner together with the presidents of the other northern region groups in Brussels. And it was a kind of goodbye for me. They organized, which I appreciated a lot. And during the dinner, they were also saying that it was thanks to the EU that they had forced them to work together, because in Brussels, when they were going to the EU institutions as a group, the offices together, they were much stronger. And then I asked, said, can you give me some of, they also said we have extremely positive examples of regional cooperation. I said, can you give me one example? And he said, one example, you know, we can send you a whole booklet of examples, and it's like I remember publicity on Belgium TV when there was a couple sitting at the table and at the dessert, and they say, well, we would like to have some Belgian cheese, and you know, which one? And then they said, well, we have a lot of choice, and they opened a door, and they had a table of 20 meters, you know, with all kind of, you know, just to say that they have multiple examples of a very successful local sub-regional cooperation. Again, and this has to be redressed in your communication, we don't have a knowledge of it. And this is very difficult for us, but the local, sub-regional level, the interaction with the people is absolutely a key, and I would say it's one of the main reasons of the success of the implementation of that policy.
Thanks very much. Sounds like good last words potentially, but I will still add a few of what I found particularly intriguing also. One is that apparently the interest of the EU and the role of the EU in the Arctic is growing, and it's still a lot to be done, I think, to understand better what's playing. I was particularly struck also as a very valid approach that the Arctic is many things, and there's an economic Arctic, there's an environmental Arctic, there's a security Arctic, and they all have different configurations and different competences of the EU in these fields that one may wish to take into account. And just from my area, I'm working a lot on climate change. I also had heard about the resolution of the European Parliament, but in a way, a lot of what motivates that is perhaps Arctic and the Arctic environment, but also that climate change we somehow need to align. And obviously, there's a much bigger question out there than just oil drilling, gas drilling in the Arctic, but what do we do with these oil-producing states when we decarbonize? And Norway is one of them. So perhaps it's more fruitful to have a discussion with Norway. What are we going to do in a decarbonizing world with our energy relationship, right? Rather than saying, stop drilling in the Arctic. and the EU is in the process of creating a just transition fund, right, in the new budget. So perhaps there's something in external relations that should be added to that we can, with our energy partners, get into a conversation on how to manage the transition, right, rather than to be speaking specifically about oil drilling in the Arctic in that context, which will have to end. And that is perhaps where Norway is not always clear in its mind. And that is actually the case. But yeah, for other reasons, for climate change reasons. Anyway, so fascinating agenda, I think, which we will pursue, Aslak will pursue here to understand that better. And we hope to stay in touch with you and learn from your experience in that, and hope to be able to contribute something so that we get a better picture and advance the issue. Yeah, with that, perhaps we can give a final hand to our panelists. Thanks very much.